Hello, Dawn here, and today I have another watercolor stamping video for you guys. I featured this on Instagram and several of you requested that I do a video, and I have done a video on watercolor stamping previously with fresh cut florals, and I'll link to that at the end, but today we're going to be featuring the fresh cut container stamp set. Now when I designed this, I had this particular technique in mind, so it's perfect for this. Fresh cut containers is the latest stamp set in our fresh cut series. It contains all of these smaller florals that you can use to create these little container gardens. This one also has a matching set of dies as well. And these larger pots in this set are scaled to work perfectly with our previously released fresh cut florals and more fresh cuts. So when you use all three of these together, you really do have a lot more possibilities. Here are a couple of examples of the types of arrangements that you can create using the fresh cut container stamp set. You can do simple arrangements or you can build whole scenes like I've done here by just adding in your own backgrounds. This technique works best with the Tim Holtz Distress Inks. You can either use the markers, the full pads, or the little mini pads. It's really whatever you have on hand or whatever your preference is. You'll need a watercolor brush, a number 4 round equivalent. I'm using this Derwent. It came with a watercolor pencil set. Some acrylic blocks to scribble your color onto, or if you have a craft mat, you can use that as well. And you'll also need a paper towel or some kind of absorbent cloth to sop up any areas when you get too much water on the paper, or if you want to take some of the water out of your brush. You'll need some watercolor paper. I'll be using the Canson 140-pound cold pressed watercolor paper. And then of course some water. I thought we would start by taking an in-depth look at how I build these arrangements and the technique itself so that you can achieve similar results. So the first thing I'm going to do is pick out my flowers. I almost always start with my flowers first, and since I'm using a marker, I'm going to use the brush tip side to swipe color onto this stamp. Now if you were using a pad, you would do it the same way as if you were, just stamping it regular. Just ink it up and then stamp it onto your watercolor paper. By using the stamps to apply our color to the paper, we have kind of taken a shortcut. The pigment is laid down on the paper in the key areas. Now all we have to do is add a little bit of water and get that ink moving around a little. This is going to emulate the look of watercolor without all the work. I'm using a just damp brush to apply water everywhere where I've laid ink down. Now what this is going to do is it's going to activate that distress ink, and in some places it's going to get more vibrant, and in other places it's going to dilute it, and anywhere that the paper is wet it's going to spread that ink to. Now bear in mind, the more water that you apply to this, the more blown out the image is going to become. So this is why it's important, if you want to maintain the shape that the stamp has laid down for us, use very minimal amount of water. If you want it to be more loose or you want that ink to spread out further, well, you would use more water. And there are cases where both methods are beneficial or preferred. After I've stamped my first cluster of flowers, I'm going to come in and start adding some greenery. I usually like to use several different shades of green and sometimes even blues when I'm adding my greens. This just adds a little depth and dimension to the image itself. Plus, once I add the water, those colors are going to bleed and blend together, and it's really going to add to that watercolor effect. If I want this to look like it's tucked underneath the flowers, then all I have to do is wipe away some with my finger, line it up, and then stamp down. And it's okay if I wipe away too much, because I can then just take that damp brush and push some of that ink into the areas where I want it to go. And you don't always have to connect all of the areas. The white breaks in watercolor is what separates the colors from each other, and it helps to keep it light and fresh. You can even use your brush to pick up some of that ink that's transferred to the tip of it and spread it around into other areas of the painting. Here you'll see that I'm dabbing it in between some of the flowers themselves, and that's so that we don't have that stark white and the flowers don't look like they're floating. It kind of grounds it, but then adds another level of green to the image. I usually like to work in, I go back and forth between adding my flowers and my greenery, and this helps me to get a more balanced arrangement. So I've added some more greenery, and now I'm going to add a different type of flower, and for that I'm using the tumbled glass. And again, I'm just going to scribble this onto the block and then stamp it down onto the paper. Occasionally I like to do a second impression, so here I've inked it up. I've stamped it off once on a scratch piece of paper, and now I'm using that second generation of stamping to lay down my ink. This is again going to give me some variation in the color and create some depth in the picture itself. Automatically, those more vibrant flowers are going to jump to the front and the lighter ones are going to fade into the back. Another useful tip is to take some of that ink again and dot it around with the flowers as well. Again, this is just going to make the arrangement appear larger, and it's going to push some of those flowers to the back. It'll make it look like there's actually more flowers than there are. And then you'll repeat all of these same steps to add the centers of the flowers as well. Remember, the more water that's on your brush, the further out this is going to spread or blur your image. So if you want these centers to stay compact, then use very little water on your brush. But if you want it to spread out, then add a little more water. If you get too much or if it's too dark, you can always use your paper towel to sop some up. Flower centers are pretty simple, so it's just as easy to use the marker itself and just dot some into the center. And again, just use your damp brush to blur them out. And now it's time to add a little more greenery. This time I'm going to be using forest moss, and I'm going to ink up one of the other little foliage images included in the set. And I'll be stamping this one off as well before I stamp it. I noticed with the darker colors, I personally prefer to stamp them off and then stamp onto my final project. This is going to transfer less ink, and this is especially useful if I want to create layers of color or dimension, because this will put down that light base color. I can add plenty of water to this to actually blur it out, and I will lose a lot of my initial shape, and that's fine because I want this to create some of those lost and found edges that is so popular in watercolor. I can emulate that here. The more water that I add to this, the further out that image is going to spread or distort, and it'll make a nice backdrop for me to come in and put some more defined images on top of it after it's dried. And I'll show you here in just a sec. I'm going to continue to add more water to this and spread this around, and then I'll show you how you can come in and add subsequent layers to really build up this image. I'm going to leave that area on the right to dry, and I've added a leaf image here on the left. Now I'm going to use some color that I'm picking up straight off the block, and I'm going to add kind of a backdrop of just green. I'm not really trying to create any definite shape here. I'm just adding some green backdrop. Then I'm going to wait for that to dry, and then I'm going to stamp a more defined leaf directly on top of it. I'll wipe away some of the ink because I want it to look like this leaf is a little bit behind the other one. And then I'll just soften out some of this. So this is a great way to, again, create that depth. I've got that backdrop of those out of focus leaves behind the leaves that are more in focus. Now the area on the right, I actually really like it, and I kind of wish I would have left it like that. It reminds me again of the lost and found edges where you have some very defined, very detailed parts of a watercolor, and then other areas are very watery or blurred out, and the edges just go off indefinitely. I am a big fan of that, and I usually try to achieve that in my regular traditional watercolors. And for some reason here, again, the camera was rolling and I was concerned about being perfect, so I had to come in and add some leaves on top. But in hindsight, watching it on video, I kind of wish I would have just left it alone. Another way to remove some of the ink, if you're not, comfortable using your fingers, you don't like to get inky, you could just use your brush to wipe some of that excess ink off. And then I'm just going to move this ink around. You'll continue like this until you've got all of your base layer done. Once your base layer is dry, you can come in and start adding some further detail if you'd like. I usually like to come straight to the paper with my marker and add some deeper color here. It's a little more controlled. I wouldn't be able to stamp right. I would never be able to line it up and stamp it right over, especially now that we've used the water to kind of blur it out. So I like to just take the marker straight to the paper and do a little embellishing. Again, I'm just picking areas that look like it's around the center of a flower, adding a little darker color on one side and then blurring it out. So I'll keep one side very light and the other side I'll deepen up. And I mentioned watercolor is all about layers. So after that has dried a little bit, I'm going to come in and I'm going to make a darker layer to the center of that flower. And this one I'm not even going to bother with spreading or softening it out with the water. I'm going to let this serve as my darkest darks. And you can do the same thing with the areas that would be in between the flowers. Deepen up some of that greenery that's, behind each of the petals. What this will do is anytime you add a dark color behind or right up against a lighter color, it will define the edge of the lighter thing and push it forward. And you can soften out some of them, and some of them you can leave super dark. Again, this is the great thing about this particular technique is everybody who does it, even though they're using the same materials, the results will be wildly different from each other. And once my arrangement is done and dry, I can come in and add my vase or my pot. I'm using frayed burlap, and I'm not going to ink up this whole stamp. Now I want this to look like some of the leaves or the foliage are hanging over the front of my pot. You would not see the top lip. So I'm only inking up the areas that I need to. I'm holding it over the image where I'm going to stamp it and just applying the ink to the areas that I want to with a marker. And once I've got my ink everywhere I think I need it, I will just stamp down. And if it's not perfect at this point, it's not a big problem because again, I can come in with the marker and fix any spots where I think I need to add some more. And the same technique that I did with the flowers and the leaves, I will then just use my damp brush to move that ink around into the other areas of the pot. So now that we've taken an in-depth look at the technique itself, I am going to show you how to kind of put that technique into action on a card. And here I'm going to start by just kind of sketching in. I want to create a whole scene. So I'm just lightly penciling in where I want my elements to go and make sure that I leave room for my sentiment. I am notorious for just going to town and then I'm all done and I have nowhere to put my sentiment. Now I'm not going to talk through this whole thing and I've already showed you the basic technique. So I am going to throw this into fast motion and put some music on for you and let you see me put this technique to work. and that is pretty much going to finish this one up. So finally, I felt like the top right portion was a little bare, so I decided to use that same leaf image and create what looks like tree branches hanging in the foreground. So this worked perfectly for it, and I thought it just added a nice little touch and added some extra depth to the image itself. So I know this turned out kind of long, and if you made it to the end, thank you. I appreciate it. Hopefully you picked up some good tips. And remember, this is all about having fun, and I know a lot of people sometimes say, well, that's a lot of work for a card. Um, I don't know about you, but last time I checked, I don't do card making because it's cheaper, faster, or easier. I do it because I enjoy it. And this is a great way to experiment with some of these techniques on a smaller scale if you're interested in moving to a larger image. And remember, all of the supplies used for today's projects are listed in the description box below with links. If you'd like to see more of this technique, click on the upper left video to see it with the fresh cut floral stamp set, and click on the upper right to see it with the pretty peony stamp set. You can find these and more at wplus9.com. And you can connect with us and find more inspiration on our blog at stampawaywithme.blogspot.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss future videos. I will see you next time. Bye!